and we are headed to space, and with our own Megan Torrey to moderate. Find my place in my notes here. Not a very good thing to lose. Chief Master Sergeant Jacob C. Simmons from U.S. Space Force. He's the Command Senior Enlisted Leader of U.S. Space Command at Peterson Space Force Base. And I'm sure Megan will tell us a little bit more about him. And I'm blocking the way up to the stage and making him jump into space here. And I think I have this fun fact right about Jacob. He grew up at Fort Hood. But look at him now.
Good afternoon. Whoa. Good afternoon.
I'm going to take the mic.
All right.
So I don't have a chair yet, so I'm going to stand. But
take this one.
No, sir, please. So I had this great opportunity to meet Chief Simmons last year at Peterson Space Force Base in Colorado. It was a very fortuitous meeting because we were able to get him here this year for a Global Security Forum. So thank you for being with us here, sir.
Well, thank you, Megan. And my appreciations to the World Affairs Council for thinking about space when you're thinking about tripwires and you're thinking about the things that we need to be focused on into the future. We get to go after lunch on a Friday, following Admiral Richardson, Senator Blumenthal, and AI. No pressure at all, but all those things leading very well into why we have a discussion about space.
It's absolutely true. I'm going to dive into some of the questions that we had prepared. And I know everybody, I want to encourage you to get your questions ready as well, because this is one of the most critical domains that we're talking about.
So before you hit the first question,
yeah,
can I set the stage a minute?
100%.
So tripwires are things that you don't see coming. They sort of catch you by surprise. I will tell you that we have seen space as a tripwire for over 20 years. Really about 25 years. Some of you may recall that around 1998, 1999, there was a study commissioned as to whether or not the United States will remain the preeminent superpower in the space domain. Keeping in mind, back in 1998 and 1999, the Soviet Union had recently fallen. China was really a partner and not awake in the sense of a threat. The whole world had watched us be able to traverse featureless deserts because of the capabilities of space. So why would we ask ourselves, are we going to remain the preeminent superpower in that domain when we were the only superpower in that domain? The answer in 2000 came back as a resounding, hey, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, 3 if by air, now 4 and 5 if by space and cyber. They're coming, specifically the Chinese and the Russians, even though they were not active at the time, at least not in the sense of a threat. At that time, in 2000, early 2001, we determined that we needed to have a cadre of space professionals to complement the command of U.S. Space Command that was dedicated to professionalizing in space and ensuring we remain the preeminent superpower. But why did it take us 20 years? Because a few months later, September 11th happened. And all of our energy, resources, thoughts, capabilities, all went towards getting after the cowards that attacked us that were now living in caves. And the space capabilities that we had were good enough to get after them. Precision guided missiles could find them, track them, and take them out. But while we did that for about 15 years, China and Russia watched us. They watched how we were able to use an asymmetric advantage from space and cyber to get after any adversary. And they realized, watching our playbook, the only way that they could ever level a playing field against us was to start with space and cyber. All the other domains, they had some pretty good footing, but they couldn't compete with us in space and cyber. And they've been building for over a decade to counter our asymmetric advantage. That is why we are here today, because we're about 20 years too late to what we started to do. That doesn't mean we're behind. It simply means that they have been advancing at a pace faster than us and closing the gap. So the Space Force, United States Space Command, are here because we need to accelerate and advance that gap again. Keep in mind that after 2001, after 9/11, we actually disestablished United States Space Command. We had a command that was dedicated to the domain 100 kilometers and above, out into the farthest reaches of our galaxy. But we disestablished it to stand up United States Northern Command, which we rightfully needed to do because someone attacked us on our home soil. But it took us another 19 years to establish that combatant command again. And at the same year, stand up a service to complement it. I think we've level set.
I think we have, sir. So you just sort of laid out the scenario that we really cannot be complacent as leaders in space. What are some of the ways that we can proactively stay leaders in space? What are some of the innovations we must be making? How can we adapt to stay leaders in space?
So great question. Let's talk about what does it mean to you when we say space? It might mean the endless expanse of astrographic universe that includes all of our planets and beyond. It might mean the operational location that's been elevated in the Unified Command Plan that says that this is now a warfighting domain. Space might mean to you the effects that are coming to you, whether it be from precision navigation and timing, satellite communications, weather, all kinds of communication capabilities, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. It could mean those effects. When we say space, it might mean to you the talent and the technologies, the people that are actually utilizing or contributing to that domain. Space might also mean to you that we now have an elevated, established force that has to defend all of those things. Space is all of that. All of those things all wrapped up into one. It is the very least visible of all the services and in the most least visible of the domains. But that does not mean that it is not consequential. It's hard to see, we're small in size, high classifications that allow us to reveal only to deter, conceal so that we can win. And so it's hard for most people to relate to the space domain because it's out of sight, it's out of mind. And everyone in this room has never lived without benefiting from it. You just don't see it each and every day. Admiral Pennington talked about embracing the sea. I would say you have to embrace space. Because if you don't have space, you don't have our modern way of life, let alone our modern way of warfare. It's a given that our warfighters in the terrestrial realm utilize space. That's a given. Everyone in this room, everyone out online, everyone in our free world utilizes space. And without it, our way of life would dramatically change.
So we know that the members of Space Force are called guardians. Can we talk about what it's like to be a guardian? What are some of the responsibilities, right? Because if it's least visible and we're not seeing it, I think it's helpful to understand what a guardians do.
So the Space Force is a sixth branch of the military. So just like our Army, our Navy, our Marines, our Air Force, our Coast Guard, they all nodded, they said, yes, we caught the Coast Guard. The Space Force, as a sixth branch, organizes, trains, equips. It generates, presents, sustains capabilities. It provides for us to be able to secure our national interest. It allows for us to project capabilities forward. It allows us to provide for our national defense. But we do it with the space domain rather than the land or the air, the sea. And we do it in a way that complements and supports all of those other domains. But because space is now contested, congested, competitive, no longer peaceful, permissible, predictive, We now have to have a service that can ensure that we can secure those national interests through space. That requires now us to have relationships with each of the services that are supporting of space while we are supportive of them.
So let's talk a little bit about how you coordinate with the other branches of service, and how that works. I think I even read this week that Space Command is standing up new units in European Command and African Command. So talk a little bit about that integration.
So the Space Force presents capabilities to each of the combatant commanders, just like the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, and so forth do. We present capabilities that provide SATCOM and precision navigation and timing and missile warning. But we do that as a service component into the combatant command that takes that capability, takes those resources, takes those service members, and goes out and fights the wars that are necessary. We work together. For a long time, space was focused really to U.S. Space Command. Prior to that, between the hiatus of U.S. Space Command, it was United States Strategic Command. Today, each of our combatant commands require a space presence. And so the Space Force is standing up service components to each of the combatant commands. We've done that in Indo-PACOM. We've done that for Korea. We're doing that in EUCOM as we talk today, EUCOM, AFRICOM. And we're going to work through each of the combatant commands, including Cyber and NORTHCOM, SOUTHCOM. So U.S. Spacecom's service component today is what's called Space Operations Command. That's one of the 3 field commands of the Space Force. And it provides that service componency to United States Space Command. That also is in transition. That is also in work. Recently, General Dickinson, my commander, the commander of U.S. Space Command, established the CFSIC, the Combined Forces Space Component Command, commander, as what he calls a CJFSIC, the Combined Joint Forces Combatant Command. That allows U.S. Spacecom to bring all the service space capabilities under one hat, specifically those things that are global space operations that provide capabilities down to the terrestrial, and those things that are on orbit that now have to be defended through orbital warfare.
So that's how you work with our United States military. What about working with international partners? Are there similar services with our partners and allies? How are you working across nations?
So we first look at the fact that our adversaries have space forces as well, right? So China has their People's Liberation Army strategic support forces. And oh, by the way, they stood those up before we stood up ours. Russia has done the same. Several of our nation partners like the UK and France, Germany and Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Germany, are really getting involved in space in several different kinds of ways, from space situational awareness, sharing data, helping us to fill in gaps in coverage because we don't have land everywhere to put a sensor everywhere. And as well as our commercial industry partners, they're also teaming in so that we can have full coverage and all-in team effort on space situational awareness. Some of those nations and others are doing things that are far-reaching. There are 11 nations that actually are spacefaring. There's 3 to 4 that can actually reach the moon. India just landed on the moon, right? China has done the same. So everyone around this world is looking at space and saying, how can I be a part of this? Because it gives an advantage. It gives a persistence. It gives some immediate capability if you have that space domain within your portfolio. So we're working out of what's called our Combined Space Operations Center, specifically with our commercial integration cell and our allied partner cells to bring in and build those partnerships. And then we utilize that in order to support our combatant commanders.
So as sort of the youngest 6th branch of the military, how do you see Space Force evolving over the next 5, 10, 15 years? How is it going to, and is it going to become much more critical?
Yes, so the Space Force turns 4 years old in December. 4 years old. So we're not 4 years old yet. Don't let that scare you. The Space Force wasn't created without history. We have decades of history from our Army, our Air Force, our Navy, our Marines, our Coast Guard. It's not like we are standing up national defense. We've done this before. And so the Space Force was born on the shoulders of the other services. So we have a history. It's not new that we're in this domain. We've been operating in space for decades, since Sputnik. So we're not new to this domain. I would say that it's not so much the guardians of the Space Force that are maturing in the domain as everything else that justifies the need for guardians in this domain. It's an understanding in the general public that space is intrinsically woven into their way of life. It is having the partnerships to understand that China and Russia are not necessarily trying to destroy the world as much as China wants to be the center of it. And if we allow space to not be available as a layer of protection, then they have clear access through space and cyber to make a significant influence. I think that the maturation is happening all around us in our civil sector and in our industry as to what now needs to be protected in space. These are things we didn't have to do before because space was inherently a safe, secure place to operate. That's maturing. Within our guardians, I think the single most thing that I would say is cultivating a mindset that is not comfortable back in the benignity of what we used to have. Understanding that you have to be able to articulate that we no longer and never will have a time where a day without space is not a concern. That's where I think our Space Force is maturing. But the major maturation is happening all around the things that justify a need for it.
Sir, so forgive me for going a little bit off script. To sort of demonstrate the sort of critical component of space, can you describe what an incident in space might look like and what some of those consequences could be?
Yes, so China in 2007 blew up a satellite. The debris field from that destruction still lasts today, unlike in any other domain. So if something were to happen in space, it doesn't swiftly sink to the bottom of the ocean. It doesn't fall from the sky. If it's traveling at 17,000 miles per hour in space as one thing, it becomes 1,000 things traveling at 17,000 miles per hour. It becomes shrapnel. Russia recently did the same thing. They shot down one of their satellites, or they shot one of their satellites, in the same orbital plane as the International Space Station with a cosmonaut on board, and our astronauts. Our ISS is still maneuvering to avoid those pieces of shrapnel. If that were to happen to, say, a GPS constellation, what does that mean for our way of warfare? No precision-guided missiles, latency in our satellite communications, UAVs returning to base. Let's set that aside and let's talk about what it does to our normal way of life. We've all heard that it takes away our ATM machines. Gone. We all hear that it takes away our ability to navigate through GPS, and that you can't maybe use your ATM card to get gas, so you can only go as far as what's in the tank. Doesn't matter if you have a Tesla, that's not going anywhere. Internet crawls, stock market crashes, agriculture crashes, shipping that we saw, that we thought was an issue during COVID, that is nothing compared to having no GPS capability, so no one's sailing all of those goods and services across the Pacific. We had issues during the 2020 COVID uproar with people breaking down windows of stores and getting into fights over rolls of toilet paper and baby formula. But what happens when you lose your retirement pension, or you have no access to Flight for Life, or you can't get on an airplane to go see a family member in distress? and we think that we are going to go after the person that's attributable, we're going to be trying to hold our nation together. My biggest concern is that if we lose space, it doesn't matter who did it. It matters that we can't necessarily recover fast. You can't replenish space without space. So once it's gone, or once it's trashed, it's just gone. That's my biggest concern about the consequences of us not understanding the necessity, the urgency for us to protect space from the start and not say that it's tradable in a war. We'll give you that if you don't take lives. If you lose that, it takes away lives in ways that we have not ever seen.
I am going to throw it to audience questions. Nick Cato, and then we'll go to Mary.
Hello. Hi, Nick Cato, the paparazzi, but also a fan of all things space. So historically, most of the technology, the exploration, everything of space has been handled by NASA, which is a civilian organization. What is the future kind of design for interactions between Space Force and NASA, both in terms of human exploration and also development and implementation of future technologies like the NERVA engine or any number of quantum technologies or, et cetera, et cetera?
So our relationship from a Space Force and the predecessor of us, the Air Force Space Command, and the Air Force has been extremely close with NASA. One of the missions of the United States Space Command is human flight recovery. All right, so when an astronaut comes back down, we work along with the Coast Guard and we work along with other recovery agencies to bring our astronauts back out of the ocean, right? We're working with NASA with regards to what's going on in cislunar. So now we have to not only be concerned about what's going on in low Earth, medium Earth, geosynchronous orbits, where typically our satellites have all operated, we now have to stretch ourselves out to the moon because there are capability areas beyond the moon and the Earth that can offer significant high ground advantage of stealth and speed. So we're working with NASA to figure out how do we track and maintain custody of assets that are in those gravity dwells. We're also watching and supporting things like the DART mission. Some of the things that we grew up saying this is science fiction, for these new leaders is going to be science fact. We just altered an asteroid. That's like phenomenal. And I get chills whenever I think about it because I watched the movie Armageddon. I said, hey, we'll never do that. And we've done that. When we think about what's going on with AI, and we think about what's going on with machine learning, we think about what's going on now with hypersonics, we need NASA as well as everyone else to be all in on how are we going to defend against these capabilities that we've only imagined. The thing that I would offer to our young leaders in the crowd is, this is the beginning of the world you're going to live in. We are literally in that bend of a knee of a curve of consequence where if things start to layer upon layer upon layer of technologies and capabilities, the things you're imagining, someone's already working on. It's not a slow development. It's not a slow iteration. So we're working with NASA to understand, and others, what do we have to do next? What's coming fast? And that's my foot stomp, is that future wars, future fights, they're going to be fast. They're going to flex, and they're going to be fast. And they're going to move at the speed of that data that AI was talking about. And they're going to move in a way that combines all the domains into one. We talk about joint all-domain. We talk about multi-domain. We may need to talk about something that's more omni-domain. Everything affects everything in a future fight. And NASA is going to be a huge part of that, as well as the rest of our commercial sector.
Thank you. Wow, I am so glad you're here, and thank you, Megan, for scheduling this awesome topic. I have like 95 questions, but I'll keep it small.
To 94?
Actually not, to 91. So the thought experiment in my mind is that the British Navy emerged initially, the most awesome fighting force that the world had ever known at that time, to protect against privacy. That is piracy, that is private property, and then ultimately turned into this awesome military. So we do have the Space Treaty of 1967. You have so far been talking about consequences here on Earth, but what if, say, Elon Musk's grandchild builds a Ritz Hotel on Mars and Chinese blow it up? Or what happens if there's a military installation or exquisite satellite something that Iran blows up intentionally in space? These things will happen, won't they? And how will you and your colleagues respond?
So norms of behavior is something that not everyone has signed up for and is very nascent. When you think about things like proximity operations, so respect for distance between objects in space. When you think about not causing debris in space because of the fact it stays debris in space, that distance and debris piece is a big deal. And then just giving due regard that you don't interrupt someone else's capabilities along the way. Those are sort of the basic norms of behavior that we really are trying to get all the nations to, and oh, by the way, most of what's in space is commercial. So getting everyone to sign up to that. Another piece is, how do you manage all that? Right now, the Space Force is doing what's called the space traffic management piece, like we would have air traffic control. Keeping things from bumping into each other by letting the owner know, hey, you're headed towards a collision. We have got to give that, divest that to the proper agency, because it's not inherently a military thing to do. What are things like space situation awareness, which tell us the what is it, the where is it, and when is it going to be somewhere else. But the more important thing is the space domain awareness that tells us whose is it, why is it there, and how is it going to be used. What's the intents? What's the motives? Is this a warfighting thing, capability, or is this a commercial, good for all mankind, scientific type of thing? And we've got to work through that piece from a military standpoint so we know how to protect high-value assets. Another piece to that is, what is the liability? Is it for us, the military, if somebody is going to do something reckless in space that's commercial? Or is it on the liability of the company that puts something in space? What obligation do we have as the United States, who is not the only operator in space, to manage and to enforce behaviors in space? What are the red lines? What are those tripwires that would cause us to actually go out and perform military actions because of broken behaviors in space? All of this part is maturing, and we have to find partnerships and cooperative means so that the tone is set, that everybody knows that this is the way we need to behave in space. This is the way everyone comes together in space. The space domain, another difference between the space domain, other than it not being able to self-heal because things don't fall fast and things don't sink to the bottom, another piece to that space domain is that everyone is affected all at once. There's no fly zone, right? If something happens in your path, you're going through it. Whether you are a combatant, whether you are commercial, whether you're a coalition force, you can become collateral damage. So in space, everybody's affected by everything else in space, if it's in your path. And that should bring everyone closer together. That, hey, we're all in this together. It's either space for all or it's space for none. I think that's where we are today. We have got to get to the answers of how do we propagate those norms of behavior out far enough to where China doesn't blow up a satellite like it just did, and Russia doesn't do it like it recently did, where Russia doesn't create or push satellites into orbit like the Nivellir nesting doll, which has projectiles on board, nesting satellites that are intended to plane change with our satellites or anyone else's satellites and hold them at risk. Or robotics on Chinese satellites that grapple with and pull satellites out of their known orbit and put them in a disposal orbit. Yes, that could clean up stuff, but what would they really do?
Well, doesn't that mean actual fighting in space?
It absolutely means that Russia and China have weaponized space.
I think we're out of time, but I want to give you the last word as our first Space Force speaker at Global Security Forum ever. I want you to tell us, if you had to leave us with just a few things, about the future, what do you want to say?
So that's the future, right here in these first couple of rows. And they're going to do magnificent things. The thing that I hope you also take away from this particular panel is that Megan chose an enlisted member. This is the difference, the advantage we have in our United States Department of Defense, is we have a professionalized enlisted force. Ask Russia how that's going for them. When you have conscripts with no conviction and no ability to develop the force behind them and really no desire to be where they're at. Our force has an enlisted backbone that is technically strong and that is dedicated to winning. And the fact that you brought an enlisted member on this stage with this audience to talk about this topic screams how important you believe getting this right is. So I would like to say thank you for giving an opportunity to an enlisted member to do this. Thank you all.